Hello and welcome to this session with cover on unlearning to build tomorrow's commons. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion around a project that Annette, who is here, has been involved in for a number of years with some folks. So the format is I'm going to do a sort of a spiel about, let's say, hopefully around 10 minutes or so introducing and framing things, and then I'm going to hand it off to some short interventions from Giovanni um, and Camilla, who are here. Um, yeah. So with that, let's have a go. So, what would it mean to begin not from what we know, but from what we must unlearn? A good place to start, given that's the title of this event, right? This is the kind of main idea that runs through the two projects that Annette Krauss has been working on unlearning. The first one, this is the new version of the book, Unlearning Exercises, Art Organizations as Sites for Unlearning, and then the newish one out this year, Unlearning Routines of the Impossible. Um, So the thing about these books is they aren't really manuals. They're kind of like scaffolds for thinking and acting differently. And they come out of Annette's collaborations, her artistic practices, many of them rooted in her collaboration with Casco Art Institute, working for the Commons from Utrecht. And one of the reasons why I've been working on this with them, and as part of this event with Cover, is we have a shared emphasis on thinking about how to build new forms of commons and commoning as organizing forms. Even though we're located in a business school and not in the art world. Um, but sort of that's a shared commonality. So coming out of this as ongoing collaboration with Casco, which is a site where artistic practice, pedagogy, and institutional experiments intersect. Casco isn't a container, but a kind of a testing ground where different kinds of practices are experimented with it and developed. And yeah, which I think is really interesting to think about art spaces not as white cubes, not as galleries where just things are hung on the wall, but as spaces where different kinds of organizing practices are tested out, developed, and yeah, elaborated. So unlearning here is not an abstract gesture. It's not just a theoretical gesture. It's a kind of practice where you're trying to unlock or unblock kinds of tendencies that prevent cooperation. Here we're thinking about ingrained routines of, attitudes of whiteness, notions of property, of individual ownership, of hierarchy, of common sense ideas. Here we could just draw a cartoon of Nigel Farage, right? That get in the way of trying to create, new forms of organizing, basically get away from forming commons. There's one essay, I believe, in the new book where Nancy Joe reminds us that these blockages they're not just structural, they're lived, they're experienced every day through small things of how we interact. So not just sort of like big theory ideas, but sort of everyday stuff. So the main question I want us to explore in this sort of discussion here is if we're thinking about how to create new forms of commons, not just what do we have to learn in order to create commons, but what do we have to unlearn? What do we have to get rid of in order to build? What gets in the way of creating commons? So that's the main question. Now, I think arts institutions are oftentimes interesting places for experimenting with these kinds of ideas. Because the economy of the arts works somewhat differently than many other places of the world. There's sort of different incentives, different norms. It can feel like things are a bit slowed down a bit, although in some cases not at all. Um, and I think what you see in these books is Annette and her collaborators trying to work through with different institutional contradictions, different tensions, how to sort of stumble into a way of, let's say, unworking some of these contradictions, tensions, and problems. Um, and it's sometimes running up against, let's say, cultural norms that get in the way or institutional problems, institutional constraints. What's interesting about it, and I think this is very important, is that unlearning isn't something where you say, okay, here's the 10 protocols of unlearning. Let's go for it. They're always very situated. So the way you would do unlearning in an art institution is probably different than the way you would do it in a business school or or other kinds of workplaces. They're always contextual. So unlearning is both a sort of a kind of method, but also a kind of ethic. Um, it's not just a blueprint. It's trying to find a way to inhabit the kind of contradictions that we're in. Um, and I'm guessing everyone here is inhabiting many different kinds of contradictions. Um, Spivak talks about this as learning to live with contradictory instructions. So you know you're told to do this, but that's the other thing at the same time, and they're in tension with each other. So there isn't going to be some sort of seamless, easy solution. Um, yeah, especially when you're dealing with sort of bigger, long-term historical blockages like racism, coloniality, patriarchy, yeah, common sense property relationships. So those are all very big things that are very difficult to undo, particularly once they become, again, to use a Faragian phrase, common sense. Um, how do you undo common sense when common sense tells you to constantly act as a sort of maximizing self-interested individual who doesn't care about others' conditions or realities? Um, how do you unlearn ingrained behaviors that point in that direction? So yeah. Um, and I think it's interesting to think about that, particularly, um, yeah, the role of the arts in unlearning, because today, where most of us are based at the University of Essex, I was announced, or we learned that the Art Exchange, which is the sort of main only campus art gallery, is being just closed. Um, so what is it? How do we think about it when the very kind of spaces where unlearning practices have emerged from, where the kind of spaces where it has seemed many for years to where we have a bit more time to think, be creative, engage otherwise, when they are being shut down at this point. Yeah. Can we find other ways to bring these kinds of practices into different environments, different kinds of spaces for testing and elaborating forms of unlearning to think about other kinds of creating commons? So that's my attempt to do a sort of brief intro, and then I'm going to hand it over to, I don't know who wants to go first, Giovanni or Camilla. Um, Uh, Whichever one wants to go first, look less panicked than the other.
Well, I am not panicking, so I can I can go. Okay. I already had like the other session, so I am relaxed now. So I have to say that this topic of unlearning and dismantling scaffoldings that basically limit our understanding and our imagination is crucial. For me, it's something that it defines me as a scholar, trying to basically grapple with all the structures that we have that we don't notice that we have, right? That frame our thinking, and then trying to have a method to dismantle that scaffolding. I think that is something that is one of the basic roles of pedagogy, right? Of critical pedagogy. And I think that the two books that Stephen sent me of Annette and her collaborators really is, it brought many themes together that were separated from me in a way. My activism and scholarship in a way, kind of bringing it together. Things that I have been experiencing outside of academia, kind of building it and connecting it to theory. So in the brief presentation, a few minutes that I have, I wanted to talk about two very important topics within this basic general topic of unlearning. One is the role of collective action, and here understood not as the collective action of movements, right? But actually the acting together, right? The idea of a non-individual action, an action that is only possible when we are together, and we basically cross information and learn how to communicate with one another. I think in this, at least in the my activism experience, this is a moment in which people start unlearning things just by being together and acting together, defying the neoliberal individualist, radical individualist outlook that is hegemonic today. So just by being together and imagining together and trying to see basically the structures that are preventing action, then that is in itself a very radical moment of unlearning, right? Even if it's not super conscious and not directed. I think when we are in assembly, in any type of collective endeavor like that, that assembly, that whole is more than the sum of the parts. So very kind of defiant of the logic of we all bring things together and we kind of pile it up, but it's more about the experience of being together and what we can do together. And here I want to bring the crucial aspect of artistic expression and the non-rational, if you will, the non-formal aspect of learning. In terms of connecting, and I think that the book does a little bit about, the second book does a little bit something on this, bringing together the body that we inhabit when we are unlearning, right? So in the trauma literature, to bring some kind of other literature to bear, it's almost a truism when we say that the body keeps the score, right? We have trauma happen to us mentally, emotionally, and our body is loaded forever with that trauma and is triggered every time that we encounter that trauma. I think we can expand that idea not to trauma, but to how we inhabit this world. So basically, our body keeps the score of the system. We are bounded materially by the system in a way. We cannot even imagine or foresee, experience nothing different in a way. It's very difficult. And rationality doesn't really cut through it. It's very difficult for you to basically convince someone to see what they don't want to see rationally. However, art has it moves us. So in a way, it has this power to unblock the body from the trauma that we have been inhabiting for so long, in a way, in this system. So I think there is material and physical blockages in our bodies and our way of being together that can be unblocked by participating in artistic expression. So not only seeing art and not only, being a witness, but basically having a more immersive experience of what is artistical expression, and also the movement of the body. So even kind of like warm-up exercises and all these things are, allow us to connect our body with our mind and our emotions. This allows us to open up and be able to unlearn what we have learned and learn again other things. So one of the phrases that I find very, that I like very much is what Annette and others said in the book about learning being uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable to learn. We need to, it's even painful to learn. I was taking my guitar again after a few years that I have been on and off, and my fingers are just so sore in a way. And relearning to play the music in a way, it is hard and uncomfortable, but it's necessary. And unlearning is also very uncomfortable. And I would say that is this uncomfort and this idea of inhabiting the contradiction, but this uncomfort that we need to translate into a need to accommodate to a new reality, to readapt in a way. And that is not an easy thing to do, but it's a necessary thing to do. And we need to move ourselves, and we need to adapt our body and our emotions and our outlook based on this. So I think that immersion into the art experience, understood very widely, allows us to connect, because we are moved by art in a way, and artistic expression in general. I think that the idea that something moves inside us like molecules that we cannot really, control, like having the chills, right? That you are in a space and you feel like an energy that is not really yours, right? It's collectively created. That allows for unblocking our senses and our outlook. So I think that is crucial for our endeavor. And the second thing that I want to bring up is the concept of praxis, and how, as philosophers and theorists, we need to not only engage with reality on the ground, but actually be guided and be determined in a way by the principles that emanate from that collective action that is geared toward unlearning. So it is not only that we have kind of some ideas of how to unlearn and then learn an alternative way of being, right? But also that those ways of unlearning need to emanate from the unlearning itself. So in a way, going back to Paulo Freire and the critical pedagogy, emancipation in a way needs to come from within. It's very contextual. So again, kind of the idea of the situated knowledge, right? That there's knowledge that comes from the ground. There's different ways of being, the tolerance towards other, outlooks. There are principles emanating from that collective action, and philosophers and theorists have the duty, I would say, to get immersed in those practices and resist the tendency to dictate how things should be, and actually be really covered in a way in these actions, and be able to distill the principles that emanate from there and have an iteration with the group or the assembly and the people on the ground. So I think this is a very difficult thing to do, because we as philosophers, we try to read a lot, and it's impossible to, in a way, when we unlearn, we are learning things again, right? Other things, and those things again become kind of a straitjacket. It's difficult for us to think outside of that new learning, right? New things that we learn. So we need to take that into account every time. So we need to be able to be dynamic in our way of thinking. And I was so boring that the thing dropped. Give me 2 minutes. And what I want to stress here is that this situated knowledge and the knowledge that comes from the ground is not neutral, in the sense that we need to be able to theorize from the reality that we inhabit. And that reality is the one of extreme inequality, of oligarchic power, and of domination. So therefore, we not only need to try to unlearn those ways with the oligarchic ethos that has been basically drilled into our souls, basically at this point, but we need to actually be pushing against oligarchy itself. So in a way, this process of unlearning is inherently anti-hierarchical, or at least inverting the hierarchy. We could talk about that in terms of a transitional phase of how to, create a new ethos that is not oligarchy but common, right? And how we think of this unlearning as basically an anti-oligarchic tendency, that we need to spot all the oligarchic domination. And yes, so basically this alternative way of learning demands this unlearning, but also a clear direction of where we want to go, in a sense of, more towards the community and not toward a new elite or a new vanguard thinking, right? We need to constantly dismantle the things that we already are, because we think about hierarchy. We think in this way. We have been trained in this way. So we tend to reenact this ways of thinking. So to finish, I want to stress that basically we need to really learn to dismantle the scaffoldings that has been said before, but also to learn to build from the ground up. There are two things that are happening at the same time, and we cannot just so the people or neoliberal subjects that exist today that try to become try to build a counter-hegemonic spaces for unlearning are also neoliberal subjects. We all are, in a way. So there's no complete truth coming from below, but there is an iteration that needs to happen through praxis from the philosophers and theorists and the community in order to constantly dismantle each other's premises in a way. So I think that is something that we need to take into account as academics of this subject. So thank you.
Is it my turn?
I think so.
Yeah. Thanks, Camilla. But also wanted to start by thanking you, Stephen and Kova, for the invitation to be part of today's conversation. And most importantly, I guess, congratulating again Annette and all the many collaborators involved in the production of these two wonderful books that we are discussing today, or that at least that form the kind of foundations for our discussion. As I mentioned to Stephen before, I thoroughly enjoyed the learning exercises, Unlearning Exercises book when it first came out. And so I was really, really thrilled to hear that there was a sequel or a second volume expanding on similar themes coming out. So while reading and as well as revisiting Annette's work, I identified several aspects that I was hoping to unpack in some depth because they overlap with questions I've been grappling with myself, not only in my own research, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in my everyday. And it's perhaps precisely in the spirit of unlearning, in this case, maybe unlearning of established academic formats and logics, that I thought I'd avoid just saying my piece and as a self-contained authoritative intervention outlining my personal take on the topic. And instead, what I want to do as briefly as possible is to share with you, and especially with Annette, a set of loosely connected general reflections in the shape of dilemmas that this important work that Annette and her collaborators have produced invites me to confront, in which I'd be very keen to hear everyone else's perspective on, precisely because I don't know how to navigate them on my own. And apologies in advance for the rambling that is to come. So the first and maybe most obvious point I have is about the relationship between unlearning and learning, which I suppose is tangled up with broader questions of instrumentality and even teleology. And I'm asking myself, is unlearning always necessarily following learning, with the former undoing the latter, perhaps as a corrective, as a negative moment or act? Or can they be disentangled, delinked, and appreciated as entirely distinct practices or processes? If unlearning does follow learning, what can, should, or must follow unlearning, if anything? Is it relearning, underlearning, lifelong and life-wide unlearning? Moreover, when does or can unlearning become itself a form of or modality or style of learning, and with what effect? In thinking about these questions, I'm also reminded of an issue that is articulated with great clarity already at the start of Unlearning Exercises by Kerstin Steckmeyer and the late Marina Schmidt, who point out the ever-present threat of institutional recuperation and repackaging in artistic and educational contexts of modes of unlearning hinging on criticality, on radical distancing from oppressive logics, attempting to hollow out and defang unlearning, turning it into an elitist empty gesture, or even an artistic genre in its own right. Those engaged in mode of decolonial and abolitionist practice recognize this dynamic all too well these days, I'm sure. And this, of course, also resonates with Stefano Hani and Fred Moten's discussion of the figure of the critical academic, which I assume many of those joining today are somewhat familiar with. The critical academic being the ultimate professional who's fueled by something of a correctional impulse that betrays hyper-identification with the very object of the critique. And what to do about all of this? How do we make sure that unlearning leads to tactical disengagement from, rather than investment and in a weird way, an attachment to the oppressive practices and spaces we want to do away with. This tension between learning and unlearning haunts me in my teaching job as well. I primarily work with postgraduate design students here in Edinburgh. And as most of you will know, postgraduate programs in the UK are now predominantly 12-month-long accreditation conveyor belts. While my colleagues and I make every attempt to encourage students to unlearn some of the deeply ingrained assumptions they come with, for example, the capitalist terms of meritocracy, individualist values, competitiveness, etc. This is a process that feels at once essential, but also truncated, as there's never the time and opportunity to follow it up with a proper and meaningful exploration, if not even a prefiguration of alternative arrangements. And this makes me think of J.K. Gibson Graham's remarks about the pitfalls of capitalocentrism. So is unlearning in this context a working towards or a working through something? I wonder if this also speaks to the distinction between constituent and destituent power, where the latter does not presuppose a moment of reconstruction following a process of dismantling. However, this same tension also haunts me in my relatively new capacity as a parent of a boisterous 2-year-old. When interacting with my son these days, I sometimes catch myself becoming an agent of the social reproduction of some norms and values that I do not subscribe to, in the attempt of keeping him safe and out of trouble, but also to avoid the risk of his marginalization, whether already now or in view of his induction to the schooling system. And my thinking here also takes me to Ivan Illich's proposition that the primary aim of the schooling system is teaching the need to be taught. He needs to learn because everyone needs to learn. I feel deeply uncomfortable about this, and I keep telling myself that the time for unlearning will come later. But is later too late? Perhaps the most glaring example of this dynamic is the enforcement of private property relations and boundaries. For instance, when my son insists on breaking into other people's cars and gardens. Mine, theirs, yours, not yours. I say these words way too often. I try to always follow up such restrictions by suggesting that, however, these things belong, whoever these things belong to might invite him to use them, in which case it'd be fine and those imposed boundaries will suddenly cease to be meaningful. How inviting can our unlearning practices be to both children and adults alike? Or better still, how can our practices of unlearning feel like invitations into other ways of doing and being together, into other ways of commoning? Just finally, a quick word on this very last question of commoning, given that it's one of the keywords of the event today. The question of commoning and its relationship to unlearning. There seems to be something intuitively appealing, a common sense, maybe as Stephen was saying, about the notion that it's easier caring or getting others to care for something that we and they have some degree of ownership over, even when the ownership is collectively articulated. This perspective, which in corporate and institutional speak is often labeled as being a stakeholder, entwines ownership, care, and responsibility as if they were functions of one another. How do we unlearn this assumption, assuming that we do want to unlearn it? I think I do as a keen student of the Undercommons, so I'm asking myself, how can, or maybe how do we already share something without owning it? How do we unlearn commoning as common ownership and retool it instead as ongoing undercommon ownership? Right, so I think I'll leave it at that, and again, apologies for if this was too much of an abstract brain dump.
No, that's good. I suppose the question is now is how we want to proceed. It seems that I might have failed to unlearn traditional conference panel organizing formats. Apologies for that. But what do you think, Annette and Mariana? What would you think is the best way forward? Do you just want to launch into a conversation, or do you want to respond to things, or what would you like to do?
Good question. Maybe should I give it a first try, Mariana? And then, I mean,
Yes, please. You have some immediate reactions, or?
well, I have some questions, which is basically I mean, what you just said, Stephen, how do we organize ourselves now in this little online gathering around many questions that actually came up. But maybe first of all, what I would like to do, regardless what has been said, or with what has been said, is kind of thanking everyone to taking the time and coming with their questions and thoughts around the book. So I'm very grateful and really appreciate well to think further on what has been still only I see it as a starting point or starting point of some kind of trying to organize a chaos in the encounters and the many discussions that I had with Casco and with the many collaborators that are in the book that helped me, well, more and more to kind of endure this bloody world that we are in. So, I mean, thanks to all of you to trying to think along and think with us, think with me to how can we, well, come together in times. Also, maybe I can say this, like in times of a televised genocide and ongoing dehumanizations in Gaza, West Bank, and many other parts of the world. And I think also all three of you actually pointed towards that, the ongoing authoritarian drifts that we are facing, which I very often feel quite kind of, well, yeah, I totally feel overwhelmed by it. But at the same time, I have a lot of, well, anger anyway, but also feeling, okay, if there's one thing that I would like to do is going on trying to commit thinking and practicing around how we can build communities against these authoritarian shifts. Well, again, thank you for that. Also, Mariana, thank you for coming. Dear collaborator over the years, without the two books and everything in it, certainly would not be possible. And when listening to actually all three of you, well, I was thinking of, I mean, I wrote down three things, which is one, and I think Giovanni, you brought late Marina Wishmit up, which I think is very present, not only right now, but also was present during, yeah, my work so far, but especially now, because I mean, when the books talk a lot about and struggle with institutional critique, she brought up something which I would certainly try to think further now. And I'm actually at the moment busy with a conference on her work around infrastructural critique. And I have the feeling we can bring that in and tie some threads together from what has been said so far. This is one thing that I could imagine. So what I'm doing is a little bit proposing something, checking in with Mariana and with everyone else, and then we decide what we are gonna tackle now. The other thing is certainly the role of artistic practice. And I really appreciate, Camilla, how you brought it in again and again, very stubbornly. And I kind of felt when listening to you is like, oh, wow, do I actually have such an optimistic perspective on the role of art? And well, certainly there is a part in me that thinks there is something there that I always come back to, although I try to leave it again and again and tried out other things. But certainly what frustrates me is the institution of art, obviously, which is another scaffold that holds, like, that is almost a grip on my body, on my thinking, on my institutional work, that I think would be worth looking into. And thirdly, what I thought that Giovanni brought up, the questions or dilemmas around the relationship between learning, unlearning, who should unlearn actually, when, how, which when I'm listening to that, I very much kind of think around the moments that I try to grapple around the legacies of maybe radical pedagogies, learning theories, and mostly actually also, I think I would, well, I've never tried it, but I would almost say that when I'm thinking about unlearning, I'm not necessarily thinking of it as an opposite to learning. It's like, it's a little bit like what's on the cover here with the impossibility, no? Like, I don't think that impossibility is the opposite of the possible, but it's rather how does unlearning and the impossible helps me to think through my relationship towards the possible, but also how does my engagement with unlearning helps me to interrogate or work upon my relationship with learning, and that is obviously kind of coming, and you said it already, like the books have very strong trajectories around my work on learning theories and learning practices. So there is something there that I try to, when it comes to unlearning, that I try to thicken around a practice of unlearning that I still think is worthwhile to thicken next to all the obviously gloomy instrumentalizations, optimizing practices, economizations around unlearning. I mean, it's very clear that I have been part of a few conversations in management contexts where it was very clear that unlearning was there as an instrument for optimizing the economization of labor processes. And I kind of like, yeah, well, I don't have to add anything there. So, which then brings me directly to moments of collectivizing, and where are the moments of where my unlearning can be fruitful in contributing to coming together and finding ways to organize differently, to come together differently in different spots. So this is also something that I'm struggling a lot right now. So I'm actually zooming in from Vienna. So I'm at the Angewandte at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. And we have been experimenting, and I say now, a few people coming together, trying to organize and finding ways of literally coming together in the university to discuss and think about strategies against the authoritarian drift that is very much visible, feelable in a university where one can also feel a lot of resource at the same time, and not only feel, it's there. So this is yeah. So these are the things I think we could go and further develop in a conversation. Mariana, what would you propose?
No, this sounds great. Maybe also on Casco's behalf, thank you, Stephen, for organizing, and the whole group for organizing this, and for collaborating on co-publishing this publication, or both of them, I guess, the iteration and the sister publication. I'm right now, as Annette situated herself, I'm in Utrecht, in Casco's office, also surrounded by publications of Annette. I don't know if it's too loud because we are building an exhibition and there are many people around me. You sound is good? Okay, good. And maybe I want to point out something as maybe the prominent site where Casco was not centered but used as a site for experimenting with unlearning, is that to bring the aspect of how this is a process and how easy it is to regress back to the habits and to maybe authoritarian tendencies within organizational structures. So how that works in collective situations where you have smaller teams of or bigger teams or assemblies, and how this is not like a project a project with a start like a beginning and an end, but an ongoing process and long-term process at that. And other than that, I am open to listen from all of you, and I think yes, we can continue with what Annette was proposing.
Well, maybe one idea we can play with, here again, thinking maybe a bit with Marina, is I particularly like when Marina engages with the work of Sun-Rathal, and particularly the notion of real abstraction. And for Sun-Rathal, real abstraction is like our ideas about value or worth don't come out of nowhere, but come out of very particular things. So for instance, in his account, like he goes back to sort of the introduction of coinage in ancient Greece and how certain notions of value come not from just like the air, but through concrete social practices organized by the use of coins, right? And we can think of the ways in which different ways that capitalism operates or patriarchy operates, not through someone coming saying, you should think this, and this, but very particular forms of social relations, different kinds of organizing things, whether it's like league tables, timetables, like different forms of measure, different technologies that create abstract ideas that we experience through how these technologies operate, right? And so when I try to think of on learning, the example I constantly fall back on it, and maybe it's kind of silly, but I think it works, is having to learn to drive on the opposite side of the road coming from the US to the UK. Now, the conscious process is very easy. You just learn the rules about how the road works. But the tricky part is all of that when you have a moment of kind of crisis and you have to respond instantly, all of your unconscious is still mapped to have you looking the wrong way. And how you do away with those underlying non-conscious patterns that you've been sort of inducted into, not through someone coming and saying, here is the ideology of correct capitalism or ideology of driving, but through the concrete processes of how things are organized to operate. Does that make sense? So what I'm curious about is if it's these very sort of like specific concrete processes which sort of almost like train us into certain forms of ideas of thinking. Are there ways we could think of almost like practices that shift us into other forms of cooperation rather than falling back into individualizing modes? Because for instance, like in the first book, like there's an example of trying to unlearn riding a bike, right? And how difficult that is. But like, yeah, I'm trying to think of like infrastructural everyday interactions which would almost like nudge us to thinking not in individualizing manners, but thinking about collectively. Does that make sense?
It also ties very nicely together what Camila said about the trauma and how the body keeps the score, no? It's kind of like how colonialism, how patriarchy, how capitalism on all members of society imprints its scores, and how we consciously, unconsciously inhabit and reenact these scores. So this is what I take from you, Stephen, and what I also tried, and what we tried. I mean, that is very important. In the unlearning to ride a bike experiment, what we tried to investigate is not so much. I mean, of course, we really seriously tried it out, and again. But what we also after the first time, actually, and I didn't know where it would lead, but what we very much were busy with, what are our defaults that we fall back onto when we are faced with a seemingly impossibility. And that is something that I felt runs through all the different experiments connected to unlearning.
Can I, is it all right if I add something to this? Yeah, so, and in doing so, I think I'm trying, and it'll be pretty clumsy, I'm sure, but to bring together a number of things that have been mentioned already. So, kind of jumping off from what both you, Annette, and Stephen were talking about now, and what was mentioned earlier by Camilla about the body and kind of bodily praxis and the importance of praxis. And linking all of this back to my experience with teaching that I mentioned earlier. So one thing that I really appreciate in the work that Annette and Casco you've been doing is this kind of focus on actual concrete material practices and kind of unlearning through practice and not just through ideas, through entertaining new ideas. And this is something that I've been thinking about more and more these days. So I teach on a program, primarily on the program that's called Design for Change, which sounds like everything and nothing. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we try to do with our students is to get them to unlearn some assumptions about what does it mean to be a designer, what's the role of design, etc. And in this process of unlearning, the unlearning is so massive in some ways, and I guess the object of the unlearning are these kind of foundational assumptions that the structure, the way we live, again, individuation being perhaps the main one, right? That then it seems to me they leaves our students with this sense of powerlessness that translates into, well, all I can do now is to let people know about it. And so it folds back into learning in this weird way where all kinds of interventions that they seem to then end up with are interventions that are aimed at consciousness raising, awareness, ideas. I know there's someone that I think you collaborated with, Annette, that I don't know personally, but I've encountered the work of someone called Anya Groten, is that right? Who writes about workshops and the format of the workshops. And I thought that was great, and because he speaks to pretty much every single student that I work with ends up doing some kind of workshop or other where the whole point is telling people things rather than practicing other ways of being together and doing things differently. And I'm trying to think of how to do the unlearning without it leading to this perverse kind of obsession with learning that comes out of it, where it's all about ideas. And Yeah, maybe I'll stop there because I feel like there's I'm running the risk of then you know rambling
I feel
for a long
cold. I
time.
feel cold.
Was that?
I feel cold from you. Like, can I respond? Because
Yeah,
of course I
yeah.
totally understand and struggle with what you have said. But there's one thing that I try actually to like a mantra to myself, that for me, unlearning, if it's purely about a consciousness raising project, I don't think it's unlearning. So it is actually falling into, and I mean, I'm falling into this trap almost every day, but it is like that's the institution of the university that almost has it on its banner, no? The consciousness raising exercise, but who actually says that that is the task of the university? And I really more and more since many years now start to see the I mean, and it's banal what I'm saying now, but the institution for me and the university is a place where to learn organizing. And how and literally organizing in the sense of how to come together. And this is what we are exercising in different forms. And so, of course, sometimes the students are like, but I didn't sign up for this course in order to learn how to organize. So at the moment, I'm running a department for teachers education. And this comes up. Oh, I need to learn what I have to teach later on the kids. Where I then say, like, but if we look at the job of a teacher, it has much more to do with organizational skills. And certainly these days, when it is when you look at a school, but also university, of how to manage all these tasks that we have to do, but also like it is like coming together with a group of people, and how do we? And maybe sometimes I think organizing is not the right word for it, but how do we structure? How do we facilitate, maybe how to prepare ourselves in coming together with other people that maybe do not want to do the same as I want to do. But we come together in a room, and it comes to back also to what Camila said about uncomfortabilities that I feel a lot. So how do I work with what I'm falling back onto? Yeah, so what I'm trying to get at is this: how to move beyond unlearning as a pure consciousness raising project. And I think it is part of it, but these other things, of how to conjure the non-rational. And I think there I see a lot of potential for myself in the arts, because it allows me to make paradoxical interventions and to allow paradoxical interventions, to let it happen, although I cannot place it, I cannot understand it literally. There's another work that I have been busy with in the last months. I have been part of a reading group around Sueli Orolnik's last recent book, which is Fears of Insurrection. Sueli Orolnik is author, psychoanalyst, Brazilian psychoanalyst, and curator. And she says something, and I just cannot get my head around it, but I feel so called by it again, which is the form of, if I get it now together, the form of subjectivation that, and now I relate it to myself, as a descendant of Western institutions, learned, is that subjectivation is based on the experience of the subject. And it is purely based on that in terms of cognitive, subjective, cognitive, emotional, sentimental, sensorial relationship. And how can we foster, is foster the right word? The experience of the outside, the subject relations. And I think this is, when I read it, like what I was relating to are these little fragments in the books, the scenes, I call them the scenes, which are these bodily scenes where that sometimes I think they, of course, they feel, when I read them myself, they feel like fiction. But are they, sometimes I ask myself, are they really fiction? So do you know what I'm talking about? The wall patrols, these one-pagers in the book, where I describe certain bodily capacities. You might call it affect, you might call it, I don't know what. I actually don't have words for it. So that I want to learn, and there I come with learn, huh? to attend to these extrasensorial capacities that I believe we have them, and we need them for coming together, for collectivizing, for bringing forms of group dynamics to the fore, that we can work with them further. And when I'm listening to myself, I think it totally doesn't make sense, but it is something that I'm struggling with at the moment. That I feel I have the space when I open the door to the Annette that might do something with artistic practice, but I cannot enter it when the other Annette, that is kind of the cognitive Annette, that works with this brain, or with this Annette in the bus of Annettes, that is kind of blocking. I think at the moment a lot of talk is around resonance, no? I mean, I guess this is where I'm also looking into. I'm not so sure about it. I think I find a lot in indigenous theories and practices. Yeah, anyway, I think I have to stop here. Does this make total nonsense? Then it's
Well, I really like the sort of linking of unlearning and certain kinds of organizing practices that may not be cognitive or rational. And to give you like a silly example of why I think it's great is I sort of came of age in sort of the Northeast Pennsylvania punk scene. Now, if you would write about like 1990s punk in Pennsylvania, you could do it musicologically, you could do it historically, but you could you could read about the lyrics or the music. But I think the most important thing was almost like what was created through learning how do you make a zine? How do you put together a show? How do you do things together? How do you organize food? How do you organize food up bombs? How do you do this? Like all those things that like won't show up in a standard historical, musicological, or artistic account, but they actually hold together the worlds of the people inhabiting them. I guess they're kind of like the dark matter of those worlds, to use like, Gregory Charlotte language, right? And it's strange because I'm not even sure how to approach that because it seems very important, but also very easy to ignore or look over.
totally.
Can I say something about art and the art scene that academia, the academicization of art? This is terrible. I have a good friend who is, bookseller in the street, basically, and he's an artist and he's amazing. And he has never been able to, put his art out. And I was helping him out. And basically then I learned that there's two categories of people. One, who are the people who went to uni basically and have all these degrees, and then there's the outsiders, and there's a special thing for outsiders. So if you're an outsider, doesn't matter how great a painter you are, you're never going to get into the mainstream because you don't have a CV. And it was just like, I understand in academia, right, that you need kind of your credentials, but this is just the separation of popular art, or the art that is the artistic expression coming from below with no training of that sort, in a way, is completely different from the one that is colonized by a more cognitive, part of ourselves. That is basically how it needs to be in order to be in that position. So I think there's a lot to dismantle, in a way, right? But I think, again, from parenting, it is not, unlearning cannot be not paired with another form of learning. You cannot say to the kid, don't do that. You need to redirect. You need to do this. And this is another form of learning. And therefore, it's going to be always contaminated by the other form, if not very conscious. However, universities have been dealing with this kind of critical approach that is very not action-based. And it's very, as you say, disempowering and demobilizing, as Giovanni says. Basically, what you're teaching the students how to be critical, and then really you have no tools to build a new world, in a way, right? So we're not doing it right. There's something that is missing, and I think it's part of connected to the democracy being the only game in town, capitalism being a hegemonic system. Like, there's no questioning, or the questioning remains in the formal, but without really understanding that whatever we think is possible or realistic is already something that is neutered in a way, that is limited in a way, that is that the possible and the real is way beyond that in a way, and that takes a lot for us to break that in a way and be able to have the tools to create something new. So I think indigenous thought, as you were saying, Annette, is really a source of a different way of thinking, of counter-hegemonic logics that are not coming from the rationalistic viewpoint of European Western, but is really coming from practice that is rooted in ancient wisdom. So
there's another question or comment.
Hi, can I make a comment here? Thanks. Yeah, it's a fascinating seminar. I didn't read the book, but I really enjoyed your sharings and the discussion so far. And it kind of resonate quite a few things that I'm doing now. First of all, there are so many points that, but I've just, sorry, it's going to be a bit messy, but I'm just going to comment on a few things. First of all, what is the motivation for unlearning? I think it's a question that hasn't really been clearly articulated. I kind of think that if we want to talk about unlearning, there has to be some rupture, some discontent, right? People feeling that something is wrong here. And I'm thinking about the example feminism, right? Where you can argue that there's quite a bit of unlearning going on. I'm observing the feminist movement in China right now. I'm, by the way, from China. I grew up under socialist China, so I share a lot of the sentiments that Mario just talked about, and I've been here 20-something years as well, but I don't think I ever really become British, right? It's just like that, that part of me is just always there. But I'm looking at the feminist movement right now and how, I mean, unfortunately in China, a lot of women are still fighting for basic rights of being recognized by their family, of choosing whether they want to get married or have children, or getting respected at work and things like that. And through means of stand-up comedy and all sorts of art forms, which they borrow from the West, they try to, more women kind of, and it's interestingly, is the idea of individualization that really helped them, because Chinese women grew up under collectivist culture, this belief that they have to be obedient to their parents, and their primary duties to family, to have children, etc., continuing the family line, etc. So they basically have to unlearn all of this moral duty and this social recognition. I just 2 days ago just met a woman, a highly successful Chinese entrepreneur, very has done everything in her life, but has never been married, and feel ashamed, right? Because she grew up like me, you know, under that culture where, you know, women are expected to do certain things. So that unlearning is extremely difficult. And so new ideas brought in, and sometimes, you know, so it's interesting that I was just reflecting on this Western individualization actually is a source of liberation for these people, for the current stage of feminist movement, and perhaps for the next stage, it will be new sources of theoretical insights or inspiration. But some rupture has to be there. And another example that I'm thinking of, and that's particularly relating to Annette's comment about moving beyond this subjectivity, the feeling, right, the embodied sensation. That is actually, I don't know whether you are talking about what is the book that you're referring to, but in meditation, in Buddhist meditation, that's exactly what we talk about. And that's the greatest unlearning I've ever encountered, because the fundamental aim, the principle is dropping of the sense of self, right? Is this idea that the sense of self is an illusion, it's a construction, right? You know, mentally, physiologically, you know, it's formulated through subjective experiences, as you mentioned, and therefore deep meditation is actually a way of, you know, what they call awakening, is actually exactly to move beyond that the subjective illusion. Now in that in Buddhist meditation, that is a way of liberation. But what troubles me is still, how is this going to contribute to social change? Right, and that is an answer that I'm still struggling with. I go to the London Buddhist Center because I'm a Buddhist. I go to the London Buddhist Center and I see lots of young Caucasian people, young men or young women, homosexual, heterosexual, etc. They go there more or less because they feel discontent with the current materialistic life, capitalist system, etc. This kind of a void of meaning, and they sort of turn to Buddhism as a source of meaning, which I guess in some way could plow seeds for social change. I don't know, but there's no vision. There's no, you know, what you talk about organizing different ways of living, commoning, etc. I don't quite see a clear path, and there's very little questioning of, you know, social structures, injustice, etc. It is all back to the self. So the idea is liberating from this self-centeredness, seeing the world, everything from the self perspective, which is fundamental to the whole capitalist institution, obviously. So yeah, sorry for rambling around, but so for me, it's also something I struggle with, right? So I'm writing a paper on silence and stillness as resistance to techno-capitalism, which is drawing upon the sort of Eastern philosophy and Buddhist ideas about basically, you know, going into silence and inactivity, refusing to sign up to all of this capitalist idea of productivity, etc., as a way of resistance. So that perhaps is a way of unlearning as well. But I would very much be interested in exploring what are the sort of artistic form, or which channels can we explore this as a more productive way of resistance beyond individual practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stephen, do we still have time for some response? How are we? Yeah?
Yeah, sure. Although we should probably, I don't want to curtail an interesting conversation, but we probably should move to pausing for the day fairly soonish. But yeah, definitely correspond.
Is it okay, Mariana? So would you like to, or is it okay if I Yeah. So I have two things that I actually also wanted to, and I kind of feel that this it just further complicates things, but I have the feeling I can tie in a little bit with both of your really useful comments. And one is about, or both, I think, or I heard it also as well, what is the motivation around at least my trajectory with unlearning, and how does that relate to questions around struggles and forms of transformation that, or simply struggle against social injustice. I mean, I think this is how I would like to frame it. And one thing where I'm coming from, and I think there are many paths, and I try to identify a few of them, but one is very importantly for me, my engagement with learning theories and practices. And one part of it for me is quite central, and that is that whenever we use the word learning, I mean, the good news about that is that we actually don't know what learning is. I mean, Stephen, you made the intervention with the real abstraction, with the value. I think there is something similar going on with learning, no? We don't know really what learning is. So, but the bad news around that is that we have we think we have a pretty good understanding of what kind of model of learning is used. And that is this common sense understanding of learning, which is the accumulation of knowledge, habits, and skills. So, but that is a model. And I think this is one intervention that I try, or that I follow along in this trajectory around different learning practices or theories: lifelong learning, unlearning, learning, radical learning, collective learning. Is like, how come that there is this dominant understanding of learning as the accumulation of knowledge? And I think it's not a coincidence that this understanding of learning so smoothly fits with what we have nowadays as a capitalist understanding of knowledge economy. I mean, it so amazingly fits together that, of course, there is a regime, exactly what you said, Mario. So these things are not innocent. These are instrumental to certain ways of living, to regimes of domination. But the second one, next to this capitalist understanding of learning, also comes along with an understanding that we are still living in a state of coloniality, which I think is, so the coloniality of learning is also very much tied to this accumulation of learning. And coloniality of learning, what I mean by that is that an accumulative understanding of learning very much ties in not only with a capitalist understanding of like like a knowledge economy, but also with the idea of progress, with the idea of development. And these models of learning have been installed and established 400 years ago. I mean, you can literally trace that back, and they have been installed by colonizers in order to legitimize conquest, in order to make people understand and believe that, of course, there is a right to oppress people. So these forms of accumulative learning are deeply imbricated by so upholding social injustice. So this is one trajectory that I'm following after engaging with. And the other one, very importantly, when I stumbled over the term, because I didn't invent unlearning, no, I'm far from it. I stumbled over the term unlearning one's privileges from post-colonial feminist theorist Gayatri Spivak in the 1990s. where she coined the term unlearning, or she used the term unlearning, or in her different fragmentary theories and discursive practices, as unlearning one's privileges. And then we come back to this notion of consciousness raising, but not only, by relentlessly working through our habits and routines of thinking and doing in order to face social injustice. So what she brings together, and since then I'm actually holding quite close to this twofold. So it's not unlearning for the sake of unlearning, what she says, but it's unlearning in order to face social or tackle social injustice. And this is, for me, as someone who is active in the artistic field, quite important, because their unlearning is also such a hype in the cultural field, no? But then in the moment when you actually bring it together, it's not a hype anymore. It's a hype. Unlearning is a hype in the moment when it's unlearning for the sake of unlearning, because it comes, yeah, it's so handy within the art academies. But when you ask, and this comes from a trajectory of radical pedagogy that I learned from Paulo Freire, that I learned from Ivan Illich, that I learned from bell hooks, that learning, bringing learning always together with the quest for social justice is a whole different question. And then the self, because Paulo Freire is someone, and bell hooks as well, who very much were emphasizing self-determined learning, just to bring that in, because I was struggling with that like a big chunk of my time, until I understood that when they talk about self-determined learning, their self is always already a collective one. And to think that through, and to try to embody that in the practice that I'm in the collaborations that I'm pursuing, and that I'm allowed to be part of, that I'm allowed to be close to, like with Casco, another art organization or cultural organization in Indonesia that I learned or unlearned a lot from, is Kunci Study Forum and Collective, who are really experimenting with forms of organizing, bringing or activating forms of artistic imagination and political organizing. So trying to be close or nearby these practices is really something that I'm very grateful for in these different motivations that I just named when it comes to the unlearning. And maybe one last thing is, because I wanted to respond to you, Giovanni, about this relationship between learning and unlearning, because it always also was such a thing for me all the time. Up to the moment when I related it with Gayatri Spivak's demand to always think through also our desires for origin stories. And suddenly I thought, like, oh, wow. So is that my origin story, that I need learning and I need to place the origin in learning in order to unlearn? How can I think differently about that and approach it differently?
By the way, when I asked about the motivation, I was not questioning your motivation. I think it's easy for critical academics,
Sure.
For critical academics to talk about unlearning, learning and unlearning. What I'm saying is that when we try to involve other people in the movement of unlearning, I find it difficult to motivate them if they don't see that there's something fundamentally unjust with the system. Even if they are the oppressed, what they usually want to do is to become the winner, to beat the system, right? One way or the other, right? Instead of challenging the system and saying that I'm not going to play this game, I'm going to step out of it, or I'm going to find an alternative system. Most people would, would still want to be the winner. in the system, because it's very costly to ask people to actually step out of the system, because it entails huge sacrifice and lots of strength, and so, and again, back to that embodied habitus that we all grew up with. So it's extremely difficult. So that's why I was saying that how there has to be something that actually move people into action or reflection. Even just reflection, I think it's hard enough.
I'm not sure if we're going to get to a point where masters are going to feel like, aha, here's a good pausing point. I don't think there is. I should have thought of one in advance, right? Do you have one, Annette or Mariana, or just... Sorry.
One last thing about what was said about meaning, because this is one we can maybe end with that, but is the search for a different meaning that is not just the accumulation of things, right? And that meaning, as Yingqin was saying, kind of from the Buddhist tradition and the interrelatedness and the kind of like universal responsibility and connectedness in a way. We need to reconnect, and for that we need meaning that is beyond intellectual meaning in a way. It needs to be spiritual, somatic in a way. It needs to be different in a way. And art, again, is at the center. Popular art, not just like institutional art expression, but it needs to be something different. And I think this is where it's a clue in a way from where do we need to move.
Good, that'll do.
Can we have a part 2? At some point.
Yes, I think it's to be continued indeed. Like we need to continue this discussion.
Okay, sounds good.
Way too many things that I personally think would be worth continuing to unpack and explore together. But
that would be amazing. I'm in.
Okay.
But let's end on this hopeful position by Camila about art.